This plaque on the first Christian church at the corner of Vine and Levergood Streets marks the location of the first building constructed in Johnstown. The building was a one-story log cabin built by Swiss immigrant Joseph Johns in 1794, when the land at the confluence of the Stony Creek and the Little Conemaugh rivers was still part of the great western frontier. Population in the area at that time was sparse. Few people ventured to live in the heavily timbered hilly lands west of the Alleghenies and east of Pittsburgh. Joseph Johns and many others who moved westward at the turn of the 19th century bought land with the intention of selling it to the many pioneers who would surely follow. Johns planned a town and speculated that it would become one of the major transportation routes through the hinterlands of western Pennsylvania to Pittsburgh and points west. The Stony Creek and the Conemaugh rivers were designated public highways. Johns knew that the Juniata Valley, just over the mountain to the east of Johnstown, was rich in iron ore. The ore was cast into pig iron there and shipped through the Conemaugh River Valley to Pittsburgh, where it was made into farm implements and household items. They were sold to people who had crossed the Alleghenies to Pittsburgh and were heading west. Johns also hoped that his town could become the county seat of the soon-to-be-formed Cambria County. First, he needed to clear the land. He built a house, planted an orchard, and prepared some land for farming. He laid out his town west of present-day Franklin Street to the point where the rivers meet. 141 lots, 4 rods wide by 16 rods long. That's 66 by 264 feet. Certain lands were for public use. Land was set aside for a building to be used as a church and a school. The land at Franklin and Main Streets was for city buildings, the land at the point for recreation, and the land where the War Memorial now stands for a cemetery. The area where Central Park is now located was set aside for the proposed county buildings. Johns named his town Conemaugh Old Town, although some called it Johnstown even then. The town was officially named Johnstown in 1834 and lost its bid for the county seat of Cambria County to Evansburg in 1804. Lots along Washington Street sold for $5. Those along Franklin and Main Streets for $50. By 1803, 3 families lived in Johnstown. By 1810, 50 families had moved in. Among those was Isaac Proctor, a shipper, who built his warehouse on Franklin Street near the Stony Creek River. Proctor stored pig iron hauled over the Frankstown Road in the fall and winter months. When the high waters came in the spring, the pig iron was floated on flatboats down the Conemaugh River to the Kiska-Camatas and to the Allegheny into Pittsburgh. Since the boats could not come back upstream, they were sold at Pittsburgh, and the riverman made his way back to Conemaugh Old Town on foot or on horseback. Farmers moved into the area around Conemaugh Old Town. Millers, tanners, coopers, rivermen, tavern keepers, and innkeepers moved into the village. Farmers forded the rivers to come into town. On market days, farmers and villagers met at the market house on the Main Street side of Central Park. The streets were lined with buckboards and wagons. The locals traded and sold their wares. Occasionally, a stranger happened into town with a new medicinal remedy or special merchandise. Conemaugh Old Town's only exports were maple syrup in the spring and timber and venison in the fall. Although life was somewhat primitive, records indicate that between 1800 and 1825, the village had at least 4 schools. A half-dozen Protestant denominations shared this building for church services. Itinerant preachers served the congregations, Mail arrived twice a week. And at least for a few years, Conemaugh Old Town's postmaster doubled as a teacher in the common school. Conemaugh Old Town was a peaceful place to live. Generally, the only people coming into and going from the village were the teamsters who transported timber, pig iron, and manufactured goods over the mountains, or the rivermen who floated those goods downstream.
Once on a time there lived a man, his name was Peter Gray. He lived way down in that town called Pennsylvania. Once on a time there lived a man, his name was Peter Gray. He lived way down in
February 25th, 1826, a decision in Harrisburg, the state capital, altered the character of the quiet little village in the Conemaugh River Valley forever. The state of New York had completed the Erie Canal. Pennsylvanians, particularly western Pennsylvanians, did not need the consequences spelled out. The Erie Canal connected New York to the Midwest. Now farm produce could be shipped more cheaply on the canal than it could be hauled overland in Pennsylvania. Travel for homesteaders going west was easier and quicker on the canal. Now fewer people would travel west through Pittsburgh and buy merchandise there. In addition, manufactured goods made in New York City could be sold cheaper in the West than those made in Philadelphia. Pennsylvanians demanded the Commonwealth do something. The state responded by building the Pennsylvania Main Line Canal, a 394-mile network of waterways and rails from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh. Freight and passengers coming west from Philadelphia were transported first by short-line railroad from Philadelphia to Columbia, just south of Harrisburg. At Columbia, the freight, or the passengers, were transferred onto a canal barge. The barges were hoisted into the canals, which ran along the state's natural waterways. At Hollidaysburg, the barges were transferred from water back to rail to be lifted over the mountain on the Allegheny Portage Railroad. The Allegheny Portage Railroad was a series of 10 inclined planes, with 5 on the east slope and 5 on the west slope of the Allegheny Mountains. Each incline was run by stationary engines and counterbalanced, just as the cars are on the Johnstown incline plane today. Between the inclines, the barges were pulled over a rail system, first by horses and mules, and later by locomotives. The summit of the Allegheny Portage Railroad was at the Lemon House near Crescent, the present location of the Allegheny Portage Railroad National Historic Site. The western terminus of the railroad was at Johnstown. By the mid-1830s, the little village at the confluence of the Stony Creek and Conemaugh rivers had become one of the 4 important towns on the most modern transportation system in the state. What a difference it made. Surveyors came first, then laborers to dig, brickmakers to make bricks, brick masons to lay bricks, mechanics to work on the engines, teamsters to transport freight and passengers from the rail terminal to the canal basin. The canal basin was Johnstown's own inland harbor. The semicircular body of water on what is now Railroad Street began at what is now Clinton and Washington Streets and stretched eastward for 600 yards. An island was formed between the basin and the Little Conemaugh River. The island and the basin area quickly became the hub of the town's activity. Innkeepers did brisk business. Taverns flourished. Monongahela rye was 3 cents a glass, or 2 glasses for a nickel. And thanks to the canal, Johnstown had a link with the outside world. Johnstowners often gathered at the basin to watch the passing parade of people as they traveled through Pennsylvania. They saw famous English novelist Charles Dickens and the funeral cortege of President Zachary Taylor. Johnstowners joined the mourners' procession behind the president's casket as it marched from the basin to the canal. Because of the canal, thousands of people heading west passed through and often spent a little time in Johnstown. A few, like Emmanuel Young, were stranded in Johnstown in a winter snowstorm and never got around to continuing their journey. The mainline canal bankrupted the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania but laid the economic base for many towns along its route. Johnstown, Pennsylvania was one of those towns. The first passenger train arrived in Johnstown on February 15, 1854, and the short-lived era of the Pennsylvania Mainline Canal was over. One by one, businesses around the basin area closed. Some towns along the canal route became ghost towns. Not Johnstown. The state repair shop for the canal had been at East Conemaugh. The Pennsylvania Railroad used this for an engine yard. Because of the canal, Johnstown was already established as a freight and passenger center. The Pennsylvania Railroad established one of their freight and passenger centers at Johnstown also. There were bridges to be built and tracks to be laid. Johnstowners secured the contracts for these. By 1855, the population of the city had grown to 6,000. The town boasted 30 grocery and provision stores, 15 dry goods stores, 4 drug, medicine, and bookstores, and 1 banking house. In addition, there were 14 shoemakers, 12 school teachers, 6 blacksmiths, 7 lawyers, and 2 dentists. Trains stopped in the city daily. On the trains, people could easily come and go to and from Johnstown. Freight could easily be shipped anywhere the railroads went, and the railroads went almost everywhere. While the railroads were generating a transportation revolution in the whole country, they were sparking another type of revolution in Johnstown. Men had been forging iron in the Conemaugh River Valley from the early 1800s. Johnstowner Peter Levergood leased his Cambria forge to a Pittsburgh company as early as the 1820s. In 1840, Johnstowner George King and Peter Schoenberger of Pittsburgh discovered iron ore on John Slay's farm just 4 miles outside of Johnstown. There was plenty of timber to burn for the charcoal needed for their first iron furnaces. And when coke furnaces became part of the iron and steel industries, there was plenty of coal. King and Schoenberger foresaw an extensive railroad system that would be built across the nation, and decided to make iron rails for the railroads. Financed by Philadelphia investors, they built their Cambria Iron Company at the present location of the lower works of the Bethlehem Steel Company. However, their technology for making iron rails was inefficient, and their products not up to the standards of rails made in the British Isles. In a very short time, King and Schoenberger and their investors were nearly bankrupt. The investors reorganized and brought the now famous steel engineer, John Fritz, to rebuild their rolling mill. When Fritz saw that many of the most objectionable features of the old mill were being retained, he refused to build the mill the company ordered. Thus, he said, I consequently concluded that I would do as I had been compelled to do before and many times since, and assume authority to go ahead. The result was the three-high rolling mill, a technological innovation that would revolutionize the iron and steel industries and save the Cambria Iron Works. Iron rails could now be made faster. With a few additional inventive adjustments, iron of a quantity comparable to the product made by foreign competitors could be produced in Johnstown. John Fritz was only one of the first of a line of important steel engineers to work at Johnstown. Over the next decade, William Pig Iron Kelly and John Fritz's brother George would also experiment with important technologies at the Cambria Works. This mill, used to make specialty steel at the Bethlehem Steel Company today, is similar to the mills the Cambria Iron Works used in the late 1800s.
We have roughers built like elephants and others thin and spare. Our catcher says it's all the same, our rollers seldom there. We have hookers, they're all skillful men, our straighteners number 5. And when we go to changing rolls, all nature seems alive.
By By the 1870s, the Cambria Iron Works at Johnstown, Pennsylvania, was the leading steel producer in the world. By 1880, Cambria employed 1,000 more workers than its nearest competitor and was rivaled in size only by a few of the nation's large textile mills. The Cambria Iron Works was the largest iron and steel employer in the United States. The effect on Johnstown was dramatic. Workers from all over the country came to work at the mills. Contracted labor was brought in from Eastern Europe, and a group of Englishmen who were skilled wire drawers were recruited and employed for the Gautier Division. In the late 1800s, the Cambria Iron Works built houses to rent and to sell to the workers. The Cambria Iron Works had its own store. To supply fabrics for that store, the Cambria Iron Works employed 200 women at this woolen mill located in Woodvale. To supply produce, the Cambria Iron Works operated farms. In their store, the Cambria Iron Works supplied shoemakers, tailors to make that suit for a special occasion, and even a clergyman for a marriage, baptism, or funeral, all available on credit for the Cambria Iron Worker. The Cambria Iron Works built a library and held school there where workers could attend evenings to learn to read or write, or perhaps learn bookkeeping or drafting. The Cambria Iron Works built a hospital where employees could obtain medical care, and a clubhouse where the management could spend their leisure hours. Still, the town was dirty, and the population of Johnstown was growing too fast. Housing was less than adequate. Working in the mill was hot and dangerous, and the lives of the workers quickly became subject to the whims of the company and the economic swings of the iron and steel industries. Still, there was a camaraderie among the Johnstown workers. Many had served in the Civil War together. Their manager at the mills had been their captain in battle, and many were in the same volunteer fire companies. Besides, there was another world outside the mill. The town thrived. Butchers, bakers, and dressmakers set up shops in Johnstown to service the many people. And Johnstown was surrounded by mountains. People traveled from Pittsburgh, Harrisburg, Baltimore, and Washington to area resorts at Crescent, Berlin, and Bedford Springs. These buildings at St. Michael are some of the few remaining reminders of the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club, one of the most prestigious of the summer resorts. Such famous men as steel entrepreneurs Andrew Carnegie and Henry Clay Frick belong to this club. Famous statesman Philander Knox was also a member. They came in summer to sit at the clubhouse and sip cool drinks and to fish in Lake Conemaugh. Some Johnstowners, like John Fulton, geologist at the Cambria Iron Works, were aware of the wealthy vacationers. Fulton knew that Lake Conemaugh was in need of repair. Alterations of the earthen dam had made it unsafe. Fulton's report on the matter was sent to the club manager in the winter of 1880. The management at the club responded by stacking felled trees and other debris against the dam's breast. Fulton and a few others continued to be concerned, but most other people in Johnstown never thought about Lake Conemaugh and the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club. In May of 1889, the town was bustling. The summer heat had not yet set in. Few were present at the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club. On the afternoon of May 30th, it started to rain. By the next day, some streets in Johnstown flooded, but most Johnstowners went on about their daily activities. May 31, 1889, at 3:10 p.m., the breast of Lake Conemaugh gave way. The dam and over 40 feet of accumulated debris hit Johnstown at 4:07 in the afternoon. Within 10 minutes, the bustling little city at the confluence of the Stony Creek and the Little Conemaugh was destroyed.
Johnstown, 1800 to 1889, is the first of 3 programs prepared for the centennial commemoration by the Johnstown Flood Centennial Project and WJAC-TV. Look for the second program in the series next fall.